pleasure to be here. It's really an honor to be back in my alma mater here. And, given the national elections now over from yesterday, we can now return back to normal, right? Yeah, some sort of normalcy, right? So as I was reflecting on this morning, I was thinking, well, look at, the new administration has, quote unquote, a fiscal cliff to address, and so we don't go bankrupt as a country in January, right? You got an economy to manage, right? 2 to 3 years is kind of weak, kind of struggling here. And jobs, where are the jobs? And the more I thought about these, and oh, by the way, the European debt crisis hasn't gone away, right? Among other things, the amount of uncertainties are incredible. Incredible for this administration going forward here. In fact, over 20 years of doing planning across companies, government agencies, international groups, nonprofits, I would say that the number of uncertainties, macro level, industry level, organizational level, local levels, has only increased. And so over the last year or two of consulting with many of these groups, the most obvious question they asked me, Jim, can you help us figure out what the new rules of the game are? How are things going to be? Is it going to go back to prior to 2008 with the economy, or is it going to be something different? Is it going to stay uncertain forever? And so my talk today is really helping you understand a little bit about what I would call scenario planning, this approach I used over the last 20 years, which is one of the only and best techniques to how to navigate with uncertainty in the world, and illustrate that a little bit through creating the National Energy Plan under the Clinton administration, 94 to 96, a 2-year effort using a multi-stakeholder process, and then draw out 2 or 3 insights that I think are relevant to this TED conference format. So scenario planning has been around about 40 years. It actually started in an oil company, Royal Dutch Shell. And Pierre Bach, who started this, got a group of smart, talented executives together and a bunch of others, and they went away for a week thinking about how was the oil industry going to be changing? This was the late 1970s. How would oil supply be changing? How would geopolitics be changing? Demand? How would consumers be adapting? Thinking ahead, far beyond a linear forecast. Linear forecasting being, let's just tweak the assumptions from last year and that'll be the assumptions for the next year, right? And they came up, thinking through the big driving of what could shape the oil industry, they came up with 3 different stories, and they're called scenarios about the future. One of which we now know is OPEC, the emergence of oil cartel in the Middle East. And that was only 1 of 3 stories. And it hadn't happened yet, but they said, we see signs of this. That is possible. So as a company, they thought through what would we need to do to be successful. They wrote them down, and they did those for each of those 3 scenarios, and they filed those things away in the file cabinet. And then they started to track the early indicators and monitors, newspaper headlines, and political developments, and sure enough, they started to see political leadership started to align in the Middle East. Oil discussions around creating this cartel started to happen. So Shell went over to the file, pulled out what they'd done, their scenario for the OPEC emergence, and they looked at it and they said, well, in order to be successful, we need to sell these businesses, we need to buy some other businesses, we need to create a trading business, and they did it. And within 2 to 3 years, they moved from number 18 in world market share in the oil industry to number 2. Why? Because the other oil majors, Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, had no framework to understand what was really going on. No framework to really understand the changes driving this, the assumptions around these things. And so what I found over the years using this technique with all kinds of organizations, 120 plus exercises around the world, was that it's such a powerful technique to perceive the world, perceive and underline what are your assumptions about the world? How does it work, or doesn't it work, right? And also what I would call re-perceive and challenge those assumptions and see the world differently through a different lens. When I talk to executives, they sort of think of it as a peripheral vision, enlarging their vision in a very different way in terms of thinking about this. One executive I've worked with many times has this wonderful story. He calls doing scenarios is like changing his center of perception and seeing new options he's never seen before. And so in doing scenarios, and it's been a lot of fun and very engaging exercise obviously for me, I started to realize, given my background in interest in environmental issues, sustainability, and also civic work, that this would really be a powerful exercise to get a group around whatever issue, local, regional growth issues, such as Missoula, Montana, or creating a national energy plan for the US, that you get a group together to really think hard about what's going on, help them reperceive what's happening and what's not happening, and get them to own the recommendations so that they move forward and implement them. And so when I think back on the President's Council work along these lines, was that we brought together 58 different stakeholders across the spectrum. Not only the typical candidates, the energy companies, et cetera, that had to support a new energy plan, but low-income advocates, environmental NGOs, labor unions, obviously scientists. We wanted to bring together those that needed to support a new national plan, if you will, but also that could resist. Because we wanted to hear what were they concerned about. We wanted to get their input and rethink how a national energy plan could be put together. This is a 2-year effort. We brought people together in various meeting formats, brought a whole group together at times, broke apart into subgroups to do research, came back together, created these 4 different scenarios I'll mention in a moment in terms of how they played out. And then most importantly, given those different futures, they said, if we were to live in those futures, any one of those futures over the next 25 years, what would we have to do policy-wise? What would the national energy plan that, quote unquote, was more sustainable, not just in an environmental sense, but societally more sustainable, have to look like? So the scenarios that you see behind you, behind me, excuse me, is, one was an obvious one, eco-crisis. Now remember, this was 1994. So that was like, what? Basically, 18 years ago. Even back then, environmental NGOs were worried we're on an unsustainable path, right? So now we have Hurricane Sandy. And no candidate in this election mentioned climate change. Isn't that interesting? No candidate. So again, still relevant, very relevant, thinking about a crisis and how that would mobilize us in a very different way. Ecotech was one reflected by the business community, because they said if we just put enough money into R&D and technology, we will change the energy system, and that's true. That's very true. And so they argued that across the board, traditional fossil fuels as well as alternative energies, et cetera, you'll have a reduced net, less energy per unit produced going forward over 25 years. So they saw this was a really important one to think about in terms of the DOE getting more funding and including it. The most interesting one was one that swoops up at the end, inclusive development. Given the stakeholders in the group, this is 94, remember, they were worried that income inequalities were getting worse in society. And it's only continued. And that's one of the things I think was very divisive about this last national election. But they said, what's really important about a sustainable society is you have to increase the middle class, help all classes of society to have a better economic future that creates a more healthy community going forward. And I thought it was a really powerful story to have to tell, thinking about inclusive development here. So what do I draw from this work in terms of 2 or 3 insights for the TED focus? I would say that, and I'm going to mention a couple of them I'm going to reference here. In Missoula, Montana, very similar format. I worked with a group thinking about regional growth planning. Missoula in the late 90s was growing tremendously fast, becoming a center for healthcare, and also having difficult temperature inversions in the winter that we're all familiar with here. And the other one was in the country of Guatemala. Actually, Guatemala, until 1999, had been gone through 36 years of a brutal civil war. And they wanted to create a national vision. And so they brought together a group of stakeholders, and we worked with them over a course of 2.5 years to create a national vision that they could call back and get behind. So a similar format, but drawing out lessons from that. I would say it really comes down, in my mind, to a simple question or a goal when I think about what makes successful civic efforts. And it's really about how can I, in terms of facilitating this, most effectively transfer, quote unquote, the ownership of the learnings, the scenarios, and the implementation of the recommendations away from me or the organizers to the stakeholders that are doing the work. And it's almost become, in a way, over 20 years, kind of a philosophical, mystical question to me, because I don't know exactly how it happens. And I've had my failures, and I've had my successes, like the National Energy Plan. It might happen early in the process, it might happen midway through, it might happen at the end. But I do draw three sort of insights from what could help to make this a better process. One is that the National Energy Plan had people with, senior executives in companies and NGOs represented. It was a very data-rich research, very mental, analytical. Nothing wrong with that. 75% of my efforts are still along those lines. But when you have a multi-stakeholder group that represents a range of a community, you've got people from across the spectrum, across the professions, across education levels that you need to engage, and they're not going to engage in the same way with just lots of data, lots of slides, lots of analysis. That's important, but it's not the only way. So what I've learned is I need to tap into other ways of their learning, other ways of how they know things about the world, right? One way is visual. We all love movies. We all love pictures, some amazing pictures we've seen earlier here too. And so in Missoula, Montana, for each of the 4 scenarios, we came up with a map, a visual map for how each scenario would look very different in terms of land use, where the environmentally protected areas were, how the area around the railroad yards would change, how the mixed density for housing may change in terms of this. And what I noticed was that the lights turned on for different people, just seeing a map. Very, very powerful. A second way that I've engaged people is really what I call learning journeys. Unlike a format where you have a conference room much like this, I actually like to take people out and see something, experience them, so they can see a part of what's really part of the dynamic. For example, in the computing technology world, when we were doing a research scenario exercise, we went down to Wired Magazine's offices in San Francisco early in the game, as they were just getting started, but they were one of the new kids on the blocks, going to be shaping media opinion around technology and computing and everything. And just going in and talking to the editors, the writers, seeing how they worked, how they interviewed people, what they thought about. People came away over dinner and we debriefed and said, I get it in a very different way. I get how media has such a powerful influence on technology or computing along those lines. So the experiential part taps into a different way we learn, we all learn. And finally, the emotional, empathic element. Country of Guatemala. So credit the 4 scenarios. After dinner one night, we had people share their own personal experiences of these 4 scenarios and elements of these. And a local businesswoman shared how her sister had been assassinated during this brutal civil war. And she went around to the military, different parts, different individuals asking, what happened? How'd this ever happen? And everyone denied that it had ever happened. Everyone. And to her right, as she was telling the story, was the first military official she had talked to who denied everything. You could hear a pin drop. That emotional, empathic connection was so present in that moment and connected everybody in that room to the power of these future scenarios, of what they wanted to aspire away from and towards something better for the country, right? And so the sense of tapping into those types of elements is so, so important. A second element that insight I would draw from this type of work is these processes are inherently messy. And I've learned to become really comfortable with these processes. The 3rd month of working in Missoula, Montana, we had an evening meeting, and it started out as a venting session. People were concerned. Where is this going? How is the city council going to use the work? Is it really going to lead to anywhere? Why are we doing this work? And the venting went on. And my partner and I, David, we looked at each other and rolled our eyes and said, oh dear, it's going to be a long evening. Thankfully, it didn't completely disintegrate. But after 4 hours of intense discussion, what really was the value in all this was that people felt more committed to the work, more committed to the purpose and intent to revise land use policy within Missoula, Montana. So what I've learned from this work over the years is you have to have a really clear purpose or intent, creating National Energy Plans 1, creating a national vision, creating a revised land use policy for a community. You have to have clear and you have to have a good process to go through that. Secondly, You have to vary the rhythm and the flow of meetings. You just can't lecture at people or have them just listen to you. You have to have them get up, work in small groups, do some other things, along those lines. Very, very important to do that along those ways. And from my own experience, it's like expect the unexpected. My experience in learning how to be comfortable with all this, I actually took improv theater training because it was so hard to get in front of these groups because I didn't know what was going to happen all the time. We'd start late, speaker would take too long, all kinds of things. But the blessing in doing improv theater was that I realized for myself, there's no script in life. And it was a really powerful insight. If there's no script in life, show up, be present, deal with the process that's going on in front of you. So processes may be messy, but they're really important. And finally, I would say relationships and bonds are as important as the ideas created. It may sound really obvious, but after 2 years of working with the President's Council folks, when they got to the recommendation stage, they really got excited. And I felt that palpable sense where they started to own the results. Energy efficiency across the board was a no-brainer. Cash for clunkers was a no-brainer. The relationships and bonds that got established were so, so powerful. So where's this work going in the future? I'd leave you with this thought. There's a small research group called the Institute of Heart and Math that I heard a speaker a couple years ago speak about. And he spoke how they've been doing research, how the heart works, the medical advances along these lines. And he said that the heart has a neural brain, in fact, that's almost as complicated, maybe some researchers would say, as complicated as the brain itself. In fact, the heart sends more messages to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. Which is kind of interesting, right? And I realized that to make this type of civic work as effective, I needed to engage more of a whole person. Not just the head and the mind and the analytical part, the whole person, the heart, the emotions and the feelings in terms of how this worked. And so in drawing through these 3 insights, learning styles, good process, relationships, again, it was only at the end of the National Energy Plan work that people really took ownership of those results. And the final thing I would say is that the Heart Math Institute speaker mentioned that the heart emits 5,000 times the electromagnetic field than any other organ, 5,000 times. And so what you see on a Kirlian photography of a person, you'll see this large heart space, but 8 to 10 feet around, the space around connects around. And they've noticed when that is, and they've been doing experiments, there's this resonance, if you will, that people have when they are shared of a shared emotion or a collective, agreement around the power of whatever they're working on. And that the quantum physics, one of the interesting things I've been reading over the last few years, is this emergence of this field or this understanding around that resonance that surrounds us all the time and impacts us. So my hope for the future of this type of civic work is that not only that it gets better and more effective in the sense of tapping into the whole person, but the quality of a particular effort gets magnified through this quantum field that we're now discovering more and more about, and influences and helps to influence other communities around the country, around the world. Thank you.